Hello, and thank you for selecting my talk on using manure shed management to connect distant links of the beef supply chain. My name is Sheri Spiegal. I'm a research rangeland management specialist at the Jornada Experimental Range in southern New Mexico. And I'd just like to take a minute to thank my team of co-authors who make up an amazing interdisciplinary team of social scientists, soil scientists, agronomists, and animal scientists, and working together, we're really trying to tackle these intractable problems surrounding nutrient management in modern agriculture. So if you've tuned into some of the other manure shed talks in the Tri-Societies meeting, you might have learned that a manure shed encompasses the land surrounding animal feeding operations onto which manure nutrients can be redistributed to meet a suite of goals related to sustainable agriculture and sustainable intensification of agriculture. The manure shed concept is really a conceptual framework for trying to deal with the wicked problems related to nutrient management in modern agriculture. And a manure shed can be managed on multiple scales, from on the farm to between counties and even between states and countries. In a recent paper in the journal Agricultural Systems, we really focused on that inter-county scale or between county scale. We identified the counties that are potential sources for manure nutrients because they have more manure from confined livestock production. The manure from confined livestock production is in excess of the cropland's assimilative capacity in those counties. So that's what makes a source county. And then we identified the number of sinks surrounding those source counties that would be needed to assimilate the excess manure nutrients from those sources. And so in this case, we were really looking at sinks in the vicinity of the source areas without favoring any one type of crop over another. Another scenario that we can think about in manure shed management and the manure shed vision is really trying to recycle surplus manure nutrients back to the feed crops that are used to actually produce the animals. So there's an ongoing cycle of nutrient flows and recycling. So in this example here, I'm showing the swine industry of the United States. And one thing that our work has really shown us is that there is a somewhat clear geographic pattern, or a straightforward pattern, in the US of swine production and the production of the feed used in the swine industry, otherwise known as corn. So we have a clear signature of where corn is grown, where swine are grown, and this kind of straightforward geographic pattern might begin to let us at least envision what would need to happen to recycle the surplus nutrients from concentrated swine production back to their feed, back to the feed crops. Of course, this is a geographic pattern alone, and many real world problems still exist that are technological, economic, logistical, of actually getting those surplus nutrients from the swine back to their feed source. Now, looking again at this case where provenance of feed is important, the beef industry is a bit different insofar as the geographic pattern is less straightforward. And that has a lot to do with the different types of links in the chain of beef production that ranges from pasture and range production on grazing lands through more concentrated stocker production, through the most concentrated of feedlots. So thinking about getting the nutrients to cycle is a little bit less straightforward when it comes to the beef industry. So that means the pattern, unlike swine, is a little bit less characterized or easy to characterize, but those same technological and economic hurdles remain. So digging in a little bit more into the beef supply chain that goes from cow-calf production on grazing lands through stocker and backgrounding through feedlots, packing and distribution. One thing to keep in mind is that at sort of lower links in the chain, it's more diffuse. There's more ranches and cow farms, and they're all across the US and Canada and Mexico. And as we move toward the feedlot phase, it gets more concentrated with fewer feedlots and more animals in those feedlots. There's also differences in the feed inputs into each link in those different links in the chain. So when we start thinking about concentrated manure nutrients and what we might want, what we could do with those nutrients that are actually in surplus of the surplus of what the feed yards can already use to grow their own feed. So what do we do with these surplus nutrients? Well, one idea is, okay, export them to the Corn Belt to feed corn, export them to feed local corn, which is tends to be used for distillers grains, but that's like a different topic. So we could, highly related, but so we could recycle it back to corn. Another option is to think about recycling it back to the hay that's used in the grazing land link in the chain. And this second approach, this recycling back to hay production, is what my colleagues and I are focused on and what I'm going to share with you today. So we have a 6-step analysis that we're working on. This is a work in progress, and so I'm going to give you kind of an up-to-the-minute summary. So we are really focused on pasture and range production in 3 areas of North America where grazing land production is really important for economic and agricultural systems. And environmental systems. So Western Canada, New Mexico, and Florida. So we're getting clear on the inventories there of cattle on grazing land. We're getting to know more about the flows of hay within those grazing land settings, and so flows of hay within and from without, and how they're imported into those settings. We're getting to know more about the flows of cattle from those 3 grazing land settings to the more concentrated links in the chain of the feedlots. We're trying to understand more about what those feedlots are actually doing with their manure nutrients, where they're flowing to now. I'm sorry, that was wrong. We're understanding the contribution of those cattle that were imported to the feedlots in the concentration of manure, and what the feedlot producers are doing with their manure nutrients. And then we're putting this all together to try to estimate the outcomes of hauling feedlot manure back to haylands, figuring out what this looks like from a sustainability perspective, see if it's viable, see if this is something we'd want to put a societal, priority, make this a societal priority. Okay, so our first step is, again, getting to know the cattle inventories in the 3 grazing land settings. I'm showing you this map because this shows the New Mexico Livestock Board districts. So there's 26 of them. And so this is the local agency that we're working with to understand the flows of cattle. So we're also understanding the stocks of cattle on rangelands from this perspective. And we're doing this not just for New Mexico, but also for Florida and Western Canada. Our quest to find out more about hay has been interesting already. So far we're learning that most of the hay used for cattle in Florida is grown in Florida, and only a small proportion is imported in. We are seeking the same sorts of numbers for New Mexico and Canada, where I think we're going to see some different patterns. The flows of cattle from the 3 grazing land settings into feedlots. Now, this has been a coup. We're quite pleased about being able to describe this, because this seems to be like a bit of a missing link in understanding like just overall sustainability options for the US and Canada beef industries. So we are working with local agencies to understand the exports of cattle from these grazing land settings to feedlots. You can see Texas is a big hot spot, and the other states of the Ogallala Aquifer. And then coming from Canada, we actually see a lot of movement to the Western US. Now, as far as understanding the contribution of the exported cattle to the concentrated store of manure in feedlots, we're using the integrated farm system model so being able to look at farm gate balances of feedlots. This is an example from the dairy industry. So we're working with LRATs to get relevant numbers for beef. And then we're taking results from our last paper in agricultural systems to look at the source counties. So these are the 390 counties that we classified as sources of manure phosphorus or potential sources of manure phosphorus, and the individual and the contribution of each industry to the surplus. And as you can see, beef is in green. There's not a whole huge number of them here, but we're certainly using these to understand more about where the manure is concentrated, where the issues are, where some concerns are. Another new source of data is from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and this is actually understanding the city and state location and the capacities of the top feedlots. So we understand where they are, how many they can feed, and we'll add that into our kind of recipe and into our stew of figuring out manure surplus and the contribution of the cattle from the grazing land settings to that surplus. Okay, so to understand where the manure in those feedlots, that concentrated manure, is actually going now, we are relying on interview data. Again, lucky to be working with a social scientist who is engaged with some producers from some of these top feedlots. So far, just a few comments from the respondents. We've learned that there is a real focus on railroads, that if railroads are not present, it's not that economically viable to redistribute manure nutrients to a producer. In other words, crop farmers, it's economically viable for crop farmers if they're located near rail lines. In response to talking about transport on roads, there's kind of a rule of thumb from this operation that if it's more than 2 miles down the road, it's probably not worth it for both parties. And the need for pelletization and commercialization. So really that processing and economic incentives to make this viable. Okay, so putting all that information together, this is kind of like where we're heading. So those dashed lines are sort of like, what would it take to get the surplus manure nutrients back to the hay fields? And is this a viable approach from economic, social, production standpoints? Is this something we want to invest in as a society? So this is where we're heading. I'd say so far what we're learning is that geographic description is very important to know what we're dealing with here with potentially recycling nutrients over these distant links of the supply chain. It's just a first step toward understanding the importance of provenance of feed and how that really, the real interaction of provenance of feed and sustainable outcomes that that we all care about. And then also one thing that we're learning, and this comes up in all the manure shed efforts, is that without a standardized data source to help us answer these questions around manure shed management, around opportunities and constraints, harmonizing data among disparate sources is a big job. And we spend a lot of time thinking about our best data sources and how to get them to talk to each other. Another thing that we're recognizing is that more widespread surveys of producers' manure management and application would be quite helpful, and also learning more about where feed comes from in these industries. So this is something that we've highlighted that would be a great help from some other USDA agencies when possible. Of course, even if we get all of our data ducks in a row and get the geography down, real world hurdles remain for manure shed management and making that a reality. And I look forward to discussing all of these with you in our group session on Tuesday, November 10th. So please join us. And with that, I'll thank my colleagues in the Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network and in our new cross-boundary collaboration with Agri-Food Canada. Without these types of network collaborations, the manure shed team wouldn't be together. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the NIFA-funded Coordinated Agricultural Project that's also working on pericoupling and telecoupling elements of US beef production, and my wonderful colleagues at the Jornada Experimental Range. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you on November 10th.